In a stunning twist that's only now coming to light, King Charles is reportedly suffering from major side effects linked to his cancer treatment, and the full truth is more serious than most realize. While the royal family has remained tight-lipped, recent developments and insider whispers have begun to expose what's really going on behind palace walls. Today we're revealing the shocking side effects King Charles has been battling and why the palace didn't want you to know. The sudden shift in the king's public presence. It started subtly, almost too subtly to notice. In the final months of 2024, many royal watchers began commenting on a slight but undeniable change in King Charles' demeanor. His usual briskness during engagements had softened. There were more moments where he seemed to pause longer than expected, sometimes looking distracted or dazed. Photos began circulating that showed him appearing pale, tired, and thinner than usual, a stark contrast to the steady image he had projected for decades. But for a man in his 70s with a grueling schedule, many brushed it off as the natural wear and tear of royal duty. After all, Charles had only recently stepped into the role of monarch following the death of Queen Elizabeth in September of 2022. But those closest to the royal beat knew something felt off. The king began quietly canceling engagements with little to no explanation. Reports emerged of private meetings being moved or postponed, and travel plans abruptly shifted. At the time, the palace cited logistical conflicts or routine scheduling adjustments. But insiders whispered that the real reason had little to do with logistics and everything to do with his health. Then came the unexpected. Buckingham Palace issued a rare statement in early 2025 confirming that King Charles had been diagnosed with an undisclosed form of cancer. It was a stunning announcement that jolted both the media and the public. Though they emphasized that the cancer had been caught early and treatment had already begun, the revelation confirmed what many had suspected, that something serious had been unfolding behind the scenes for quite some time. And while the palace framed the treatment plan as routine and manageable, the king's increasingly sporadic public appearances told a different story. Something more was happening, something they weren't saying. The royal image of strength and continuity was starting to fracture, not publicly, not dramatically, but in quiet, unsettling ways. And the side effects of his treatment, as we would later learn, were far more intense than anyone had anticipated. The palace's silence in public concern. When the palace confirmed King Charles' cancer diagnosis in early 2025, the statement was brief and sanitized, exactly what we've come to expect from royal communications. It emphasized optimism, early detection, and a treatment plan already underway. The language was calm, measured, and deliberately vague, but it left one massive question unanswered. What kind of cancer was it? For a royal family that thrives on controlled transparency, the omission was glaring. Within hours, speculations swirled. Was it prostate cancer? Lymphoma? Something more severe? The palace offered no clarification, and that silence became deafening. What followed was a flood of unease, not just among royal watchers, but also among the British public. Opinion polls showed a sharp uptick in concern for the king's health and for the monarchy's long-term future. After all, Charles had waited longer than any heir in history to become monarch. He had only just begun carving out his reign. To many, it felt cruel that his time on the throne might be cut short by something as relentless as cancer. Journalists pressed for answers, but Buckingham Palace refused to go beyond the initial announcement. That only fueled more speculation. Was it worse than they were letting on? Was the king's condition deteriorating? What were they hiding? What complicated matters further was that the king himself remained largely out of sight. While official royal social media accounts posted carefully staged photos of him working behind the scenes, Charles wasn't appearing in public, not even in virtual capacities. Occasionally, grainy long-lens paparazzi photos would surface showing him leaving Clarence House or entering a private clinic. In some, he looked fragile, in others, visibly disoriented. Still, there was no word from the palace. And that silence was more than just concerning, it was calculated, because behind those palace walls, something was unfolding that they weren't ready to admit. Not yet. Inside Clarence House, leaks and whispers. While the official story remained locked down, quiet leaks began trickling out from those closest to Clarence House. Staffers, aides, and even former royal physicians started sharing whispers of what was really happening behind the regal facade. According to several sources, the king's treatment was not as smooth or tolerable as the palace initially claimed. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Reports suggested that King Charles had been experiencing intense nausea, dizzy spells, and even blackouts. One insider described him as visibly weakened and said he required assistance walking short distances during some of his worst days. Another mentioned unplanned overnight stays at private clinics, not hospitals but discreet facilities with royal-level privacy. These weren't part of any public itinerary. No press, no statements, just silence. The most startling rumor came from a former royal aide who claimed that Charles had suffered a brief collapse during a private dinner in February of 2025. The event was immediately scrubbed from records, and guests were sworn to secrecy. Whether it actually happened remains unconfirmed, but what's clear is this: the treatment was taking a heavier toll than anyone wanted to admit. And it wasn't just physical. Sources also pointed to emotional strain. The king, long known for his sense of duty and order, reportedly became frustrated with his own limitations. He canceled several personal projects. Public events were passed on to Prince William and Princess Anne. Camila, ever poised in public, was said to be deeply worried in private. Her protective presence at recent appearances hadn't gone unnoticed. She rarely left his side. Yet, despite mounting concern, the palace stayed silent. And while they hoped to maintain calm and stability, all that silence did was create more suspicion. Behind the castle walls, things were clearly unraveling, and outside, the public was beginning to catch on. The warning signs we all missed. Long before the palace acknowledged King Charles' illness, there were signs, clear ones in hindsight, that something wasn't right. During the closing months of 2024, eagle-eyed observers began to notice small inconsistencies in the king's routine and appearance. First, there were changes to his posture and movement. At events, he stood less confidently than usual, often leaning slightly to one side or clutching nearby furniture for support. Some noticed he would fidget with his hands more frequently. A nervous tic, perhaps? Or an attempt to mask pain? Then there were his speeches. Known for delivering calm, deliberate addresses, Charles began stumbling over certain words, occasionally pausing mid-sentence, as if momentarily disoriented. In a December 2024 appearance, he appeared to lose his place in a speech and awkwardly smiled it off. It wasn't alarming at the time, but now it takes on new meaning. Even his face seemed to shift. Viewers commented on his pallor, his sunken cheeks, the increasingly visible bags under his eyes. There were whispers that the king had lost weight, not the kind of weight one sheds through exercise, but the kind that melts away during serious illness. Yet, through all of this, the palace issued no explanation, no acknowledgement that anything was different. Many believed it was just the weight of royal duty. The crown, after all, is a heavy burden. But those closest to the monarchy knew better. Charles was always a man of discipline, someone who valued structure, punctuality, and strength. If he was slipping even slightly, something was wrong. And so, while the rest of the world went about its business, the clues continued to accumulate. The truth was hiding in plain sight, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Not yet. Camilla's quiet role in the crisis. Throughout this period of uncertainty, one figure remained unusually present and quietly powerful: Queen Camila. While her public role has always been more subdued than that of her husband, insiders say her influence behind palace walls became essential during King Charles's health crisis. It was Camila who reportedly insisted on scaling back his travel and demanded more medical oversight during private intervals between events. And it was Camila who began accompanying him to nearly every engagement, not just out of duty, but out of concern. Observers noted how closely she watched him. During public appearances, her hand would often hover near his arm, ready to steady him if needed. She whispered to him more frequently, sometimes prompting him when he seemed distracted or forgetful. To most, these moments appeared endearing, even touching. But for those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy, it was clear Camilla was managing more than just the queen consort's role. She was managing the king himself. One palace aide described her as the quiet commander, saying she had taken over many decision-making responsibilities without fanfare. As Charles grew more fatigued, Camilla shielded him from unnecessary meetings, filtered the information he received, and allegedly clashed with staff who failed to recognize the gravity of his condition. Her strength in public also helped reinforce a fragile illusion that everything was under control. She smiled when necessary, nodded politely, and reassured dignitaries with practiced ease, but behind closed doors, the toll was mounting. She reportedly broke down in private after one particularly difficult week in February of 2025, when Charles was forced to cancel multiple engagements at the last minute due to unexpected side effects. Through all of it, Camilla never left his side, and while the palace has yet to officially acknowledge her behind-the-scenes efforts, those close to the family say it was Camilla who held the institution together when the king could not. The state visit that nearly didn't happen. In March of 2025, King Charles was scheduled to lead a highly anticipated state visit to Italy alongside Queen Camilla, a diplomatic gesture meant to reinforce Britain's post-Brexit alliances and royal presence abroad. The visit had been planned for months, and preparations were already in motion. But what the public didn't know was just how close it came to being cancelled. Behind the scenes, Charles was struggling. His doctors reportedly advised against long-haul travel due to fatigue, dehydration risk, and increased vulnerability to infections, all common side effects of his aggressive treatment regimen. The king, however, insisted on going. He believed canceling would send the wrong message, one of weakness or retreat. For a monarch still carving out his reign, the optics mattered. But his physical condition was wavering. According to one insider, Charles required intravenous fluids the night before departure. Another claimed he spent much of the flight in a private medical suite on board, tended to by a discreet team of physicians. And once in Italy, the schedule was radically adjusted. Meetings were shortened, walkabouts were avoided. Private downtime between appearances stretched longer than planned. Photos from the visit showed a visibly pale and weary king, though he managed to smile through most engagements. Queen Camilla once again stood close by, often guiding him between events. Observers noted his stiff posture, slower gait, and the way he avoided bright lights or loud environments, signs of overstimulation often linked to treatment side effects. While the visit was hailed as a success by the British press, those within diplomatic circles whispered that something had clearly changed. One Italian official privately remarked, "He did his duty, but he looked like a man paying a price for every step." The state visit became more than a diplomatic gesture. It became proof of just how far Charles was willing to go to preserve the image of strength, even as his body continued to betray him. It also signaled something even more sobering, that the monarchy was being held together by sheer willpower, not wellness. The side effects they tried to hide. As pressure mounted and royal watchers demanded clarity, whispers about King Charles' treatment side effects became impossible to ignore. Behind the carefully curated palace statements was a far grimmer reality, one that the public had only glimpsed in photos and brief appearances. The truth was, Charles wasn't just experiencing mild fatigue or occasional discomfort. His side effects were serious and in some cases debilitating. According to multiple sources close to the royal household, the king had been enduring intense nausea, frequent dizzy spells, and what one aide described as violent tremors in his hands. These episodes were often triggered by stress, physical exertion, or even certain foods. At times, he reportedly needed assistance standing for long periods. And while the public saw only brief moments of poise, Behind the scenes, he was resting in private quarters, sometimes unable to speak without strain. One alarming report even suggested Charles had suffered a temporary loss of vision during a private meeting at Sandringham, a side effect known to occur in some forms of cancer treatment. Though unconfirmed, the rumors sent ripples through the palace, prompting a short-notice checkup with his personal physician and a sudden reshuffling of his upcoming schedule. But perhaps the most tightly guarded secret was the emotional impact. Sources say Charles became increasingly withdrawn. He canceled meetings he once eagerly anticipated, grew short-tempered with staff, and expressed fears that his reign might be cut short. He reportedly confided in Camila, expressing doubt about whether he could continue representing the crown if his health continued to deteriorate. Despite all this, the palace remained quiet, not because they were oblivious, but because they were protecting the image. In the monarchy, perception is everything, and admitting that the king was in real, persistent distress would have shattered the illusion of stability they worked so hard to maintain. But the illusion couldn't hold forever, and soon it would begin to crack. Public reactions and the shifting mood of the nation. As the whispers grew louder and the truth became harder to conceal, the public began to sense that something serious was unfolding behind palace walls. For much of King Charles' reign, the monarchy had carefully managed its image, stoic, composed, unwavering, but now that image was beginning to unravel, and the people were noticing. Public concern turned to speculation. Tabloids ran headlines with increasingly urgent tones asking what the palace wasn't telling the country. Columnists demanded transparency. "The king deserves privacy," one article read, "but the public deserves honesty." Meanwhile, social media turned into a battleground of theories, with users trading photos, analyzing footage, and offering amateur medical diagnoses. Some accused the royal family of hiding the severity of the king's condition. Others defended their right to manage the crisis in private. Polls conducted in late March of 2025 revealed a dramatic shift in national sentiment. Confidence in the king's ability to fulfill his duties had dropped by nearly 20 points in a matter of weeks. At the same time, support for Prince William and calls for him to take on more public responsibilities surged. It wasn't that the public had turned on Charles. It was that they were scared. They saw a monarch who looked increasingly frail and a system that refused to admit anything was wrong. Even among royalists, the mood was sobering. Outside of Buckingham Palace, well-wishers began leaving handwritten notes, wishing the king strength and recovery, an act usually reserved for mourning periods or national tragedies. The public's tone had shifted from admiration to concern. And still, the palace said nothing. But the silence now felt less like protection and more like a wall, one that separated the public from the truth. And on the other side of that wall, it was becoming clearer by the day, the king was struggling more than anyone had dared to say. The turning point they couldn't ignore. By early April of 2025, the palace reached a point where silence was no longer sustainable. The rumors had become too loud, the sightings too frequent, and the concern too widespread. After a particularly worrying appearance, in which King Charles appeared visibly shaken during a brief walkabout in Windsor, the pressure finally boiled over. Cameras caught him gripping Camilla's arm tightly, blinking repeatedly as if trying to stay upright. The clip aired across the country, prompting headlines that the palace could no longer control. It was then, and only then, that a new statement was issued. The palace confirmed that King Charles had experienced what they referred to as a temporary side effect from treatment, which required short-term medical observation. The language was still carefully chosen, but the message was clear: the king was not well. This marked a shift in strategy. For the first time, the palace acknowledged that the king's treatment was producing complications. While they still avoided naming the type of cancer, they subtly confirmed what many had suspected, that the side effects were interfering with his ability to perform royal duties. The statement also introduced something new, the possibility of delegation. Prince William was said to be ready to support when needed, and Queen Camilla would take on an increased public role. Though framed as temporary measures, many saw it as the beginning of a slow transition, a passing of the torch not yet formalized but quietly underway. Inside royal circles, this moment was described as a soft reset. While Charles remained king in name and spirit, the realities of his condition demanded a new approach. The illusion of total control had been shattered, and in its place came something far more human: vulnerability. And for the first time since his diagnosis, the palace let the world see that. What comes next for the crown? Now that the truth has begun to surface, the question remains: what does this mean for the future of the monarchy? King Charles may still be at the helm, but there is no denying the shift that's occurred over the last few months. A man once expected to guide the monarchy for at least a decade now finds himself battling not just the expectations of a nation, but the limitations of his own body. The royal family is adapting, slowly but visibly. Prince William has been taking on more responsibilities behind the scenes and appearing more frequently in public engagements. His poised presence, calm demeanor, and growing popularity suggest he's being positioned, not explicitly, but unmistakably, as the monarchy's next stabilizing force. Meanwhile, Camilla continues to serve as both partner and protector, ensuring that Charles remains visible without being overexposed. There's talk of a transition era, a period where the crown continues to function, but with more shared duties and subtle redistribution of power. It is unlikely the palace will ever admit this directly. After all, abdication remains a taboo word in royal vocabulary. But those watching closely can already see the writing on the wall. The monarchy, much like the king himself, is being forced to evolve. It is no longer just a question of ceremony and tradition, but of resilience and adaptability. And in this moment, that adaptability will define the legacy of King Charles' reign. Not the pomp, not the pageantry, but how he faces a deeply personal battle under the most public of lights. As the world watches, one truth remains certain: behind the crown is a man fighting to uphold it.